A new Lexus and an old reality. Isaiah Cole had seen many things during his time as a judge, cases that twisted his gut, lawyers who brought their egos into the courtroom, and defendants whose fate balanced on the thin line of justice. But after a particularly grueling week, he wasn't thinking about any of that. All he wanted was to enjoy the cool, quiet evening drive back to his upscale neighborhood, Briarcrest Grove, a leafy and peaceful area that felt a world apart from the gritty streets where he'd grown up. With each turn on his drive home, the troubles of the courtroom faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the mellow notes of Coltrane's A Love Supreme flowing from the Lexus speakers. Isaiah had treated himself to the car barely a week ago, a sleek black LS 500, a symbol of all the years of hard work, the late nights, and the battles won against those who doubted him. To anyone else, it was just a car, but to Isaiah, it was a hard-earned reward and a subtle, silent testament to his journey. Growing up in the urban neighborhoods of Memphis, Isaiah had faced his fair share of challenges. He'd been raised by his mother, a woman of unbreakable resilience who had worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table. From an early age, Isaiah had seen her sacrifice and felt the weight of her dreams resting on his shoulders. In a city where opportunities for young black men were rare, his mother had drilled into him that education was his way out, a ticket to a life beyond the rough streets that surrounded them. Isaiah's drive to succeed had led him to law school, where he'd been one of the few black students in his class. Despite the whispered doubts of some of his classmates and professors, he had pushed forward, excelling with determination. Now he was known as Judge Cole, a name that carried weight, respect, and integrity. Yet, every day he fought not only for justice in the courtroom, but also to overcome the unspoken biases that came with his position. Isaiah's success had not come without its struggles. Even now, with years on the bench and a distinguished reputation, he was sometimes met with skepticism and thinly veiled judgment, though most were careful to keep such feelings hidden. It was a quiet but persistent reminder that no matter how high he climbed, there would always be some who saw him as an outsider. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange as he made his way through the familiar streets. The Lexus felt smooth beneath his hands, and Isaiah allowed himself to relax into the comfort of the plush leather seats. His thoughts drifted to his family, especially his son Marcus, who was now in high school. Isaiah had raised Marcus to be aware of the world and to understand the power of self-control and composure. Isaiah often told him, "Don't let anyone else's prejudice dictate who you are, son. Show them through your actions, not your anger." As Isaiah neared the gates of Briarcrest Grove, he noticed a flicker of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it might be a patrol car simply passing by, but then he saw the unmistakable sign that it was directed at him, a quick, sharp flash of the cruiser's headlights. He could feel his stomach twist into a familiar knot. He'd been careful, staying well within the speed limit, and hadn't missed a stop. There was no reason to pull him over, unless, of course, there was. Suppressing a sigh, Isaiah signaled and pulled to the side of the road, his heart beating a little faster than he would have liked. Even as a judge, he felt the sting of injustice, an uncomfortable reminder of past encounters with authority figures who had once dismissed him without a second thought. He took a calming breath, ready to explain that he was a judge, a resident of Briarcrest Grove, and the rightful owner of the Lexus. He knew who he was, after all, and it was simply a matter of politely reminding others. The officer approached, and Isaiah took in his towering, broad-shouldered build and unsmiling expression. His badge gleamed under the streetlights, and as he approached, his eyes held a cold scrutiny that Isaiah couldn't ignore. "License and registration." The officer's voice was curt, almost dismissive. Isaiah's brow furrowed, but he complied, reaching into the glove compartment and retrieving his documents with steady hands. When he extended them to the officer, the man snatched them without so much as a glance at Isaiah. It was as though Isaiah's very presence was an irritant. "Is there a problem, officer?" Isaiah asked, his tone respectful but firm. He was not only a resident of Briarcrest Grove, but a well-respected figure in the community. There had to be a mistake. The officer's gaze didn't soften. In fact, it seemed to sharpen with a sudden, almost accusatory glint. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he ordered, a hint of tension coloring his voice. Isaiah's hand stilled, his pulse quickening. This was no ordinary request. The officer's hand had shifted subtly, resting on his holstered firearm. Isaiah's heart began to race. "Excuse me, officer, but could I ask what this is about?" he inquired, keeping his voice measured. His position as a judge granted him certain protections, but he knew from experience that things could escalate quickly. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area, and your car matches the description," the officer replied, his tone flat and uncompromising. Isaiah felt his jaw tighten. His Lexus was brand new, a car he had purchased just a week ago, with paperwork to prove it. But he knew that arguing wouldn't help him here. He took a deep breath and complied, stepping out of the car and facing the officer, who eyed him with a wary skepticism that was all too familiar. The officer directed Isaiah to place his hands on the hood of the car, and a sense of humiliation settled over him. He could feel the eyes of neighbors peeking out from behind curtains and blinds, watching the scene unfold, as if he were some criminal trespassing in their neighborhood rather than their neighbor. As the officer began a rough pat-down, Isaiah's mind raced. He'd spent his career upholding the law, ensuring that people, regardless of race, received fair treatment in his courtroom. And yet, here he was, being treated as a suspect rather than a respected judge. The sting of irony was hard to ignore. "Listen, officer," Isaiah began, keeping his voice steady though he felt the anger bubbling under his calm exterior. "I am Judge Cole. I live here in Briarcrest Grove, and this is my car. I believe you're making a mistake." The officer paused, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Yet he didn't relax his stance. Instead, he radioed in, his tone neutral as he confirmed the details Isaiah had given him. As he did so, Isaiah's eyes swept the houses around him. Seeing the faint glimmers of faces behind drawn curtains, there was a subtle sense of betrayal, as though the neighborhood he had invested in, believed in, was now watching him with suspicion. The radio crackled, and the officer stiffened slightly, his face taking on a hint of embarrassment as he received the confirmation that Isaiah was, indeed, Judge Isaiah Cole, and a resident of the community. The officer turned back to Isaiah, the initial hostility now replaced by a strained politeness. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Judge Cole. Just standard procedure." Isaiah's mouth set in a firm line as he studied the officer, who avoided his gaze. He wasn't a man to hold grudges, but this was more than just an error. It was a reminder of the biases that still lingered, even in places like Briarcrest Grove, where success should have been his shield. "Standard procedure," Isaiah replied quietly, his voice laced with the disappointment he felt. "Maybe for some of us. But officer, I hope you understand that things like this can't keep happening." The officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but offered no further apology. As Isaiah returned to his car, he felt the weight of eyes on him, a silent but pointed reminder that even in the quietest corners, prejudice had its way of making itself known. As he continued his drive home, Isaiah's thoughts turned to his son. How could he explain to Marcus that, despite his achievements, his education, and his career, he could still be seen as less than worthy? The world would look at him and see his skin color before his accomplishments, and that was the harsh reality Isaiah had hoped his son would never face. But tonight, Isaiah's hope was shaken. Confronting the unseen. When Isaiah Cole pulled into his driveway, the weight of the night settled heavily on his shoulders. The towering oak trees around his house cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, but the familiar sight offered little comfort. Tonight, the house he had worked so hard for felt almost foreign, as though the events of the last hour had changed something within him, subtly but irreversibly. He shut off the engine and sat in the quiet, wrestling with a tangle of emotions, frustration, anger, but above all, a deep and unyielding sense of injustice. Isaiah stayed in the car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel as he tried to regain his composure. He knew he couldn't walk into the house looking like this. His son, Marcus, was only 16, and Isaiah had always been a rock for him, a symbol of success, stability, and resilience. To Marcus, his father was the very image of what it meant to rise above life's challenges. But tonight, Isaiah felt something he hadn't felt in years: helplessness. A knock on his window jolted him out of his thoughts. It was Leah, his wife, her face a mixture of concern and relief as she leaned down to peer inside. "Isaiah," she said softly, her voice barely audible through the closed window. He sighed, rolling it down as he forced a smile he didn't quite feel. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice betraying a trace of weariness. Leah opened the car door, taking his hand and gently urging him to step out. Isaiah noticed her eyes linger on his face, searching for answers. She didn't ask him what had happened right away. She knew him well enough to understand that he would talk when he was ready. Together, they walked into the house, the warmth of their home standing in stark contrast to the cold reality of the world outside. The walls of their living room were lined with family photos, awards, and certificates, each one a reminder of Isaiah's accomplishments and the life he had built against all odds. But tonight, those reminders felt almost like hollow trophies, a veneer that couldn't quite mask the underlying challenges he still faced. Leah led him to the kitchen, where she poured him a cup of his favorite tea. "Marcus is upstairs," she said, her voice gentle. "He's got a big test tomorrow, so he's been studying all evening." Isaiah nodded, feeling a twinge of pride at his son's dedication. Marcus was a smart, ambitious young man with dreams of following in his father's footsteps, maybe even becoming a judge one day. But as Isaiah thought about the advice he'd given his son over the years, stay calm, be patient, don't let them see you sweat, he wondered if he was doing him a disservice. What good were those values if they couldn't shield him from the harsh realities he'd face tonight? Leah watched him, sensing the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. Isaiah took a sip of the tea, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. He looked at Leah, his best friend, his confidant, the person who had been with him through every struggle and triumph. "She deserves to know. On my way home, I was pulled over," he said, his voice low. He watched as Leah's face shifted from concern to quiet anger. "In Briarcrest Grove?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isaiah nodded. "The officer said my car matched the description of a stolen vehicle. He ordered me out, made me put my hands on the hood. He patted me down, Leah, right there in front of everyone, as if I were some stranger who didn't belong." Leah's hand tightened around her mug, her knuckles turning white. "But you're a judge, Isaiah. They know who you are. This shouldn't be happening. Not here. Not to you." Her voice trembled, the anger and disbelief mingling with an old, familiar hurt. "I told him who I was," Isaiah replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "But it didn't matter. Not until he got confirmation on his radio. To him, I was just another black man in a fancy car. And that was all he needed to decide I was suspicious." Leah reached across the table, placing a hand on his arm. "Isaiah, this isn't right. You've worked too hard to be treated like this. You deserve respect." Isaiah nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for her unwavering support, but it did little to soothe the frustration simmering within him. "I know, Leah. But the question is, what am I supposed to do about it? Filing a complaint might get a slap on the wrist, but will it change anything? Or will it just become another story that people talk about for a day and then forget?" Leah's gaze softened, and she squeezed his arm. "Maybe. But what if it doesn't end up forgotten? What if this is a chance to make a real difference? You have a platform, Isaiah. You're a judge, a respected figure in this community. If anyone can make people listen, it's you." Isaiah fell silent, contemplating her words. He had always believed in the power of the law, in the idea that justice could be achieved if people followed the right processes. But tonight had shaken that belief. How could he uphold a system that seemed to turn against him the moment he stepped outside the courtroom? Just then, Marcus came bounding down the stairs, a thick textbook under his arm. He paused when he saw his parents in the kitchen, sensing the tension in the room. "Hey, Dad," he said, his eyes flickering between Isaiah and Leah. "Everything okay?" Isaiah forced a smile, trying to keep his tone light. "Yeah, everything's fine. Son, just a long day at work." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He was too perceptive, too keenly aware of his father's moods. He walked over, setting his book on the table, and pulling up a chair. "You don't look fine," he said, a note of concern in his voice. "What happened?" Isaiah hesitated, glancing at Leah. They had always tried to be honest with Marcus, teaching him about the world without burdening him too heavily. But he was 16 now, old enough to understand the complexities of life, and if tonight had proven anything, it was that he couldn't protect Marcus from the realities of the world forever. "I got pulled over on my way home," Isaiah said slowly, watching Marcus's face closely. "The officer thought my car was stolen." Marcus's brow furrowed, confusion giving way to a look of shock and indignation. "But that doesn't make any sense. They know who you are. You're a judge. Why would they?" He broke off, his mouth tightening as understanding dawned. "Was it because you were black?" Isaiah took a steadying breath. "Yes, son. That's exactly why." Marcus's face darkened, a mixture of anger and sadness settling over him. "So it doesn't matter what you do or how hard you work. People still see you as a threat." Isaiah swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his son's words. He wanted to reassure him, to tell him that things would get better, but tonight, that assurance felt hollow. "I know it's unfair, Marcus, and I know it's hard to understand. But this is the reality for people like us. We can work twice as hard, achieve twice as much, and still face prejudice. It's not right, but it's the truth." Marcus shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "It's not fair. You shouldn't have to go through this. Nobody should." Isaiah placed a hand on his son's shoulder, trying to convey a sense of calm. "I know. And that's why I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Leah, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "We'll stand by you, Isaiah. Whatever you decide to do, we're with you." The warmth in her voice was a balm to Isaiah's wounded pride, and he felt a surge of resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his family, for his son's future, for every young black man who would one day walk the same path. This was about more than a single incident. It was about challenging the biases that ran through the very fabric of society. Isaiah spent the rest of the evening planning his next steps. He would reach out to colleagues, local leaders, and journalists, sharing his story and calling for accountability. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and that he might face backlash. But he also knew that staying silent would be a disservice to everything he believed in. The following morning, he prepared for what he knew would be a long and challenging journey. As he buttoned up his shirt, a sense of clarity settled over him. This wasn't just about righting a personal wrong. It was about forcing the community to confront an uncomfortable truth. When he left the house that morning, he was no longer just Judge Isaiah Cole. He was an advocate, a voice for the marginalized, and a father determined to leave a better world for his son. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew he couldn't afford to turn back. A stand against the shadows. The morning light seeped through Isaiah Cole's office window, casting soft, warm hues across the dark oak desk piled high with case files and legal briefs. But today, his attention wasn't on the cases before him. His mind was firmly set on what had happened the night before and the course of action he had committed to taking. Isaiah was a judge, yet he hadn't been seen for his position or character, but for his skin color alone. The thought of it gnawed at him like an ache he couldn't ignore. He had worked tirelessly to be a figure of integrity and justice, yet when he was pulled over, he had been reduced to a stereotype, an image others projected onto him without knowing the man beneath. But today, he would not remain silent. Today, he was going to use his voice and position to confront the deeply rooted biases that ran through his own community. He had already spoken with Captain Reynolds the night before, and this morning, they were scheduled to meet to discuss Isaiah's demands for public accountability. Isaiah had also reached out to several journalists he knew, people who had covered stories of racial profiling before, and they were more than willing to cover the judge's experience. Yet as he readied himself for the meeting, he couldn't shake a sense of apprehension. There was a knock at the door, pulling Isaiah out of his thoughts. "Judge Cole, Captain Reynolds is here to see you," his assistant's voice called softly through the door. "Thank you, Ellen. Let him in," Isaiah replied, his voice steady as he rose from his chair and straightened his shirt. Moments later, Captain Reynolds entered, his expression guarded. He looked every bit the seasoned officer he was, thick-set with a streak of gray in his hair, his face hardened from years of navigating the complexities of law enforcement. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Captain," Isaiah began, gesturing for Reynolds to take a seat across from him. The captain nodded, but his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "Judge Cole," he said, his tone formal but cautious, "I understand this is a sensitive matter, and I want you to know that we're taking it seriously." Isaiah leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Captain, this is about more than sensitivity. What happened last night was an egregious display of racial profiling, and as a judge, as a black man, I cannot let it go unaddressed. I want this to be handled publicly, not behind closed doors with a quiet reprimand." Captain Reynolds shifted, his jaw tightening. "I understand your perspective, Judge, but going public with this, there are protocols, and I have to consider the morale of my officers. Officer Rhodes, well, she's a good officer, and I don't think she meant for it to escalate as it did." Isaiah felt a flicker of irritation. "Morale. Captain, this is about accountability. When Officer Rhodes pulled me over, she saw me as a threat, not as the person I am. And if I, a judge, can't even get a fair shake in my own neighborhood, what does that say for the average black man or woman who doesn't have a title or a platform?" Reynolds let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Judge, I don't disagree with you. But understand, these officers work under tremendous pressure. This wasn't intentional. She was acting on the assumption that the vehicle matched a stolen car in the area. And yet, she did nothing to confirm her suspicion until after treating me as guilty," Isaiah countered, his voice firm. "Captain, it's time we hold our officers accountable for their assumptions. The community needs to see that the police are willing to address these biases openly. And if you're unwilling to take that step, I'm prepared to make a public statement myself." Captain Reynolds' face reddened slightly, and he was silent for a long moment. Finally, he nodded, albeit reluctantly. "All right. We'll proceed as you've requested. I'll arrange for a public announcement and a statement from the department regarding Officer Rhodes' conduct. But Judge Cole, I want to make it clear, this is going to stir up a lot of reaction, not all of it supportive." Isaiah held his gaze steady. "I understand, Captain, but I'm willing to face that. This conversation is overdue, and if it makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's time they confront why that is." Reynolds sighed, standing up. "We'll have a press briefing tomorrow at noon. And Judge, I hope you're prepared for the backlash. These issues tend to attract a lot of strong opinions." Isaiah rose and extended his hand. "I appreciate you agreeing to this, Captain. I truly do. And I'm prepared for whatever comes." The captain took his hand in a firm shake, though his expression remained clouded with worry. "Good luck, Judge, and I'll see you tomorrow." As Captain Reynolds left, Isaiah felt a strange sense of relief and resolve. The conversation was difficult, but it had gone better than he'd anticipated. Now came the more challenging part, facing the public and standing firm in the face of scrutiny, both from those who would support him and those who would not. By the next morning, news of Isaiah's experience had already spread throughout Briarcrest Grove and beyond. The community was abuzz with conversations, some supportive and others skeptical. Isaiah had received calls from friends and colleagues expressing their support, but he had also received several anonymous messages and emails warning him that going public would only damage his reputation and cause unnecessary trouble. Yet he knew he couldn't back down. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had experienced similar prejudice, but lacked the voice or position to speak out. He'd long told himself that he could make a difference within the system, but now he understood that sometimes change required confrontation, even if it made people uncomfortable. When Isaiah arrived at the police station for the press briefing, a small crowd had already gathered. Reporters stood near the entrance, their microphones and cameras at the ready. Community members, too, had come, some to show their support, while others looked on with skepticism. A few of his colleagues from the courthouse were present, standing in solidarity. Isaiah's heart swelled at the sight. Their presence reminded him that he wasn't alone. Captain Reynolds approached him, nodding tersely. "Ready, Judge?" Isaiah gave a firm nod. "Ready as I'll ever be." As they approached the podium, Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, waiting for the murmuring crowd to settle. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We're here to address an incident involving Judge Isaiah Cole, which occurred 2 nights ago. In our commitment to transparency and accountability, we want to acknowledge that a situation arose that may have involved racial profiling." Isaiah stepped up to the microphone, feeling the weight of the eyes upon him. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds, and thank you all for being here. I've lived in this community for many years, and I've dedicated my career to upholding justice and fairness. But 2 nights ago, I experienced firsthand the type of treatment that too many people of color face regularly, even here in a neighborhood as supposedly inclusive as Briarcrest Grove." He paused, scanning the crowd, noticing familiar faces among the strangers. "When I was pulled over, the officer made an assumption based on my appearance alone. Despite identifying myself and showing proof of ownership, I was treated as guilty before innocent. I've chosen to speak about this publicly because silence only allows this kind of behavior to persist." A reporter in the crowd raised her hand, and Isaiah nodded for her to speak. "Judge Cole, how do you respond to those who say that this was simply a misunderstanding, an unfortunate error that doesn't reflect the department's overall behavior?" Isaiah's gaze was steady as he responded. "I'm here to hold our system accountable, just as we would hold any individual accountable for their actions. If we dismiss incidents like this as simple misunderstandings, we overlook the root problem, a system that too often judges people based on appearances rather than actions. This isn't about one officer. It's about a systemic issue that needs addressing." As he continued to speak, he could see nods of agreement from many in the crowd, but he could also feel the undercurrent of resistance from those who didn't want to acknowledge the discomforting reality he was presenting. The truth was hard, and some would rather turn away than face it. When the briefing ended, Isaiah felt a surge of pride and relief, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Standing up meant inviting scrutiny, backlash, and even hostility, but he was prepared for it. As he left the podium, a young black man approached him, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Judge Cole," the man said, his voice filled with emotion. "My brother was pulled over last month in Briarcrest Grove, and he was treated just like you were. He didn't have your status, though, and he couldn't do anything about it. Thank you for standing up." Isaiah felt a lump in his throat as he shook the young man's hand. "That's exactly why I'm here. We all deserve to be treated with respect. Thank you for sharing that with me." Over the following days, Isaiah's statement rippled through the community. Many supported him, thanking him for his courage, while others criticized his choice to go public, accusing him of causing division in a place that had been peaceful until now. Some of the local media latched onto this narrative, painting Isaiah as a divisive figure. Yet, as he read through the criticism, Isaiah remained resolute. Every step forward in justice and equality required discomfort, required honesty. And if that made him an uncomfortable figure in some people's eyes, he could live with it. As he prepared for bed that night, Isaiah thought of Marcus and Olivia, his children, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was a battle he was willing to fight, and he would continue to stand firm. For them, for the young man who had approached him, and for everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. Ripples through the community. The days following Isaiah's public statement were anything but quiet. The story of Judge Isaiah Cole, a well-respected black judge, facing racial profiling in his own neighborhood, struck a chord in Briarcrest Grove and beyond. It quickly spread through the local news outlets and even caught the attention of a few national publications. Isaiah had expected some support and backlash, but nothing had prepared him for the storm that followed. Each day brought new developments. Isaiah's inbox was flooded with emails from people sharing their own stories, some voicing solidarity, while others accused him of stirring trouble. The responses were mixed, ranging from heartfelt thanks to outright hostility. But the support from those who shared similar experiences fueled Isaiah's resolve to keep pressing forward. Isaiah's son, Marcus, faced the repercussions of his father's decision almost immediately. At 16, Marcus was well-liked among his peers and known for his intelligence and athletic ability. Yet just a day after the press briefing, he felt the sting of his father's controversial stance in an unexpected way. As Marcus walked through the school hallway between classes, he could feel eyes on him, the whispers of classmates rippling in his wake. Usually, his friends greeted him with high fives and jokes, but today, their expressions were tight, their voices subdued. He caught fragments of conversations. "Did you hear about his dad? I mean, it's not like he's a victim. He's taking things too far." It stung, hearing the doubt and disbelief from people he'd known for years. Marcus walked faster, keeping his head down, but his mind was racing. He had always looked up to his father, a man who stood for fairness and justice, who had taught him to believe in the power of the law. Yet now, that respect Marcus had for his father seemed to separate him from others. The day reached a boiling point during lunch. Marcus was sitting with a few friends when Ryan, a classmate he'd known since elementary school, turned to him with an expression of frustration and confusion. "Hey, Marcus," Ryan began, trying to keep his tone casual. "Can I ask you something about, what your dad said on TV?" Marcus felt the eyes of his other friends turning toward him. He forced himself to stay calm. "Yeah, what's up?" he replied, his voice steady. "Don't get me wrong," Ryan said, "but I mean, don't you think your dad's kind of overreacting? It's not like he was hurt or anything, right? My dad says that stuff happens to everyone, and he just made it into a big deal for nothing." Marcus clenched his fists under the table, feeling his face heat up. He knew Ryan wasn't trying to be malicious, but the ignorance in his words struck hard. "Ryan," Marcus said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "it's not just about one incident. It's about how people look at us differently, no matter what we achieve." Ryan raised his hands defensively, a dismissive grin on his face. "Dude, I get it, but come on. Your dad's a judge. Everyone in Briarcrest Grove respects him. Don't you think he's making it harder on himself by turning it into this huge thing?" Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but forced himself to keep calm. "My dad has spent his whole life working for respect, Ryan, but even when he's earned it, he still gets treated like he doesn't belong. It's not fair, and just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean it's not real." The other boys at the table shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to change the subject, and Marcus let them. He knew there was no point in trying to convince people who hadn't experienced it themselves. But as he finished his lunch in silence, a resolve took root in him, a determination to understand his father's fight, and stand by him, even if it cost him some friends along the way. When he got home that evening, Marcus found his father sitting in the study, poring over legal documents. He looked up as Marcus entered, offering a small, weary smile. "Hey, son, how was school?" Marcus shrugged, dropping his backpack on the floor. "It was different," he said, his voice heavy. Isaiah's brow furrowed, and he gestured for Marcus to sit beside him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Marcus sat down, running a hand through his hair. "People keep saying you're making a big deal out of nothing, that it's just one incident. They don't get it, Dad. They think you're overreacting." Isaiah sighed, nodding as he rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "Marcus, people often fear what they don't understand. They see what they want to see. And when it comes to issues like this, sometimes it's easier to look away than to confront the uncomfortable truth." Marcus looked at him, a mixture of frustration and admiration in his eyes. "But you're not going to back down, are you?" Isaiah shook his head, a determined glint in his eyes. "No, son. I can't. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure that one day, you and your sister don't have to face the same struggles. This is bigger than one person's discomfort." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. "Then I'm with you," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what." Isaiah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more to me than you know." As the week progressed, Isaiah continued to face waves of both support and criticism. Some community leaders reached out to him, offering their support and even inviting him to speak at local forums about his experience. Yet others, including some prominent figures in Briarcrest Grove, were less enthusiastic, viewing Isaiah's actions as a threat to the neighborhood's reputation. One evening, Isaiah received an invitation to speak at a town hall meeting organized by a local advocacy group. The meeting was set to discuss racial equality and address issues of racial profiling, and Isaiah knew it was an opportunity to share his story and highlight the changes he wanted to see in law enforcement. Leah urged him to attend, knowing how important it was for him to have his voice heard, and Marcus insisted on coming along, determined to support his father. The town hall was held in a community center just outside Briarcrest Grove, and when Isaiah and Marcus arrived, they were met with a packed room filled with faces from all walks of life, young and old, black, white, and everything in between. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of anticipation, hope, and for some, reluctance. Isaiah took his place on the small stage, adjusting the microphone as the audience quieted. He could feel Marcus's steady gaze on him from the front row, and that simple presence gave him the courage he needed. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "I know that for some, my recent statements may seem divisive, and for others, they may have been long overdue. But what happened to me was not an isolated incident. It's something that happens to people of color in communities across the country, and it's time we confront it openly." As he continued, he shared not only his recent experience, but also the stories of others who had written to him. Stories of discrimination and fear, of people who were forced to justify their presence in their own neighborhoods. He spoke of the changes he wanted to see: mandatory bias training for officers, accountability measures, and community oversight committees to ensure transparency in law enforcement. The crowd listened in silence, some nodding in agreement while others sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. When Isaiah finished, the room erupted into applause, but as he scanned the faces in the crowd, he knew the battle was far from over. As he stepped off the stage, a woman approached him, her face lined with age, but her eyes bright with determination. "Judge Cole," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I've lived in this community for over 50 years, and I'd never seen anyone speak so honestly about these issues. Thank you." Isaiah felt a surge of gratitude and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for your support," he replied. "This fight is long overdue, and I'm grateful for every voice that stands with me." But as the night wore on, not everyone shared her sentiment. Outside the community center, a group of individuals had gathered, some holding signs that read, "Keep politics out of Briarcrest," and "Judge Cole, don't divide us." Their expressions were cold, And as Isaiah and Marcus approached, one man stepped forward, his voice laced with anger. "Judge Cole, we respect your work," the man said, though his tone was anything but respectful. "But this isn't what Briarcrest Grove needs. You're stirring up resentment, making people look over their shoulders in their own neighborhood. We don't need this kind of division." Isaiah met his gaze evenly. "I'm not here to divide anyone," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to make sure that every member of this community is treated with respect and dignity. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe it's time they ask themselves why." The man's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his own face set with a resolve that mirrored his father's. "My dad's just asking for fairness. If you're against that, maybe you're the one causing division." Isaiah felt a surge of pride as he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him away from the crowd. Together, they walked to the car, the tension of the night weighing on them both. But as they drove home in silence, Isaiah knew one thing with certainty. He had taken the first step in a long journey, and with his family by his side, he was prepared for whatever lay ahead. Isaiah's stand had ignited something in the community, a mix of anger, admiration, and for many, a long overdue reckoning with the biases that had gone unchallenged for too long. The road was uncertain, but with each step, Isaiah felt a growing resolve, knowing that he was fighting for a better, fairer future, not just for himself, but for all those who came after. The cost of justice. The days following the town hall were a whirlwind of activity for Isaiah and his family. The media attention surrounding his experience had only intensified, with national outlets picking up the story. Some framed Isaiah as a champion for racial justice, while others portrayed him as an instigator, accusing him of disturbing the peace in Briarcrest Grove. Isaiah was well accustomed to controversy from his years on the bench, but he hadn't anticipated the toll this would take on his personal life. One morning, as Isaiah was getting ready for work, he found Leah in the kitchen, her face tense as she read from her phone. She glanced up when she saw him, a pained expression in her eyes. "Have you seen the latest comments?" she asked softly, turning the screen toward him. Isaiah hesitated, then took the phone, scanning the words on the screen. There were supportive comments from those praising his courage, but others were filled with vitriol, accusing him of ruining the community and creating division where there was none. One comment stood out. "If he wants equality so badly, maybe he should go back to where he came from." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Isaiah had devoted his life to building a career that contributed positively to society, and yet these people, some of whom might have been his neighbors, could dismiss him so easily, reducing his life's work to a label and a stereotype. Leah reached for his hand, her face etched with worry. "Isaiah, maybe it's time we take a step back. You've done so much already. No one could fault you for wanting to protect our family." Isaiah let out a heavy sigh, the weight of the past few days pressing on his chest. "I know, Leah. I know it's a lot. But if I back down now, what kind of message am I sending? That the moment things get tough, we retreat. I can't live with that." Leah's gaze softened, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "I understand. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself. This fight isn't worth losing yourself over." Isaiah nodded, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze, but he could see the strain this was taking on her, and on Marcus and Olivia. His children had become more withdrawn, hesitant to speak out, as though afraid of drawing more attention to their family. Isaiah felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he was sacrificing his family's peace for a battle that might never end. That afternoon, Isaiah found himself back in his chambers, trying to focus on the stack of case files that lay before him. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the events of the past few days. The town hall, the backlash, the quiet looks of disapproval from some of his colleagues at the courthouse. As he sifted through the legal documents, he found himself growing increasingly frustrated, the weight of everything building to a breaking point. A sharp knock on his office door jolted him out of his thoughts. Ellen, his assistant, stepped inside, her face drawn with concern. "Judge Cole, there's someone here to see you," she said hesitantly. "A young man. He says he wants to speak with you about the incident." Isaiah raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. "Send him in, Ellen." Moments later, a young man entered, his expression nervous yet determined. He looked to be in his early 20s, with a worn hoodie and jeans, his hands fidgeting as he approached Isaiah's desk. "Judge Cole, my name's Devin," the young man began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say, thank you for what you're doing. I know it's not easy, but you're making a difference." Isaiah nodded, gesturing for Devin to sit. "Thank you, Devin. I appreciate that. What brings you here today?" Devin hesitated, glancing down at his hands before meeting Isaiah's gaze. "I'm from Briarcrest too, but, well, my family's been here for generations. It's home, but it doesn't always feel like we belong, you know." His voice softened. "Last year, I got pulled over in my own neighborhood, just for driving home late after work. The officer thought I was acting suspiciously because I was taking a shortcut. But really, he just couldn't believe someone who looked like me lived there." Isaiah listened, the familiar ache settling in his chest as he heard Devin's story. It mirrored his own experience, the same baseless suspicion, the same silent judgment. "I filed a complaint," Devin continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But nothing happened. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. It felt like my voice didn't matter. But when I saw you speaking out, it made me feel like maybe, just maybe, things could change." Isaiah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Devin's story settle over him. He'd known from the beginning that his actions would have repercussions, but seeing the impact it had on someone like Devin reminded him why he couldn't back down. "Devin," he said, his voice steady, "your voice does matter. And if I have to be the one to make sure people listen, then that's what I'll do. Thank you for sharing your story with me. It takes courage to speak out, especially when it feels like no one's listening." Devin offered a faint smile, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you, Judge Cole. Just, please don't give up. We need people like you." After Devin left, Isaiah sat in silence, reflecting on the conversation. His resolve hardened. The battle wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or voiceless. However, as the days went on, the toll of this fight became increasingly clear. A few days later, Isaiah was driving home when he noticed a patrol car following him. He kept his speed in check, his hands tight on the wheel as he felt the familiar tension creep over him. For several blocks, the car stayed close behind him, its lights off, shadowing his every turn. It was a silent reminder, an unsettling presence that spoke volumes without saying a word. When he pulled into his driveway, the patrol car slowed, lingering at the edge of his property before finally driving off. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest, the frustration boiling over. It was one thing to face public backlash, but this felt personal, invasive. He tried to approach this battle through legal channels, through measured words and public statements, but it was becoming clear that some would do whatever it took to silence him. That evening, as he sat with Leah and the kids at the dinner table, the strain was palpable. Marcus was quieter than usual, poking at his food, and Olivia kept glancing toward him with worry in her young eyes. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Dad, do you think it'll ever stop? All the stuff you're going through?" His voice was soft, almost resigned. Isaiah set his fork down, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, son, but I do know that if we don't speak up now, it'll only get worse. Sometimes change takes time, but if we give up, then nothing will ever get better." Leah reached over, taking his hand. "We're with you, Isaiah, no matter what. But promise me you'll be careful. I don't want this to hurt our family." Isaiah nodded, feeling the weight of his family's support and the sacrifices they were making for his fight. He knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he also knew that he couldn't let the fear of backlash silence him. This was about more than his pride or reputation. It was about justice, about the future he wanted for Marcus, Olivia, and families like Devon's. Over the following days, Isaiah continued to push forward, meeting with community leaders, speaking at events, and working with activists to bring attention to the issue of racial profiling. His stance inspired others, and soon there was a growing coalition in Briarcrest Grove and neighboring communities, demanding accountability and change in law enforcement practices. Yet, with each step forward, the opposition grew louder. Isaiah's phone was constantly buzzing with messages, some supportive, others filled with venom. The threats had become so frequent that Leah had suggested they consider moving, but Isaiah refused. He was determined to hold his ground, unwilling to let fear drive him away from the community he had worked so hard to be a part of. One evening, as Isaiah was preparing to turn in for the night, he received an anonymous email that sent a chill down his spine. It was a single sentence, but it carried a weight that lingered in the room long after he read it. "You're playing a dangerous game, Judge Cole." Isaiah felt a surge of anger, but also a twinge of fear. He was accustomed to criticism, even threats from his years in the courtroom, but this was different. This was personal, a reminder that some would go to great lengths to protect the status quo. He considered showing it to Leah, but decided against it. She was already carrying so much, and he didn't want to add to her worry. Instead, he forwarded the email to Captain Reynolds with a brief note, requesting an investigation into the source. Reynolds had been supportive in public, but Isaiah knew that even the captain's support had its limits. For now, Isaiah would continue his work, pushing forward one day at a time, knowing that his family, his community, and people like Devon were counting on him. As he lay in bed that night, Isaiah stared up at the ceiling, the weight of his choices pressing on him. He'd known from the beginning that this journey would be difficult, but he hadn't expected the personal sacrifices it would demand. Yet as he thought of Marcus, Olivia, and the future he wanted for them, he knew he couldn't turn back. In the morning, he would continue his fight. For every person who had been treated unfairly, for every voice that had been silenced, and for a future where his children could walk down the streets of Briarcrest Grove without fear. The stakes were high, but so were the rewards, and Isaiah was willing to pay the price, no matter how high it might be. The unseen victory. Isaiah woke up with a sense of both resolve and fatigue, as if the weight of the past few weeks had finally settled into his bones. The threats, the backlash, the late-night meetings, all of it had left him drained. Yet today felt different. Today, he had a crucial meeting with the Briarcrest Grove Council, a gathering he had fought to arrange, where he intended to propose a series of reforms to address racial profiling and improve community relations with law enforcement. The council had been resistant at first, reluctant to address what they considered isolated incidents. But after weeks of pressure from Isaiah and his supporters, as well as growing media attention, they had finally agreed. Today was a chance to be heard, to lay his vision for change on the table. Leah sensed his tension and gently placed a hand on his shoulder as he sat at the breakfast table. "Today's the day," she said, her voice a mix of encouragement and concern. "You've done everything you could, Isaiah. Just know that whatever happens, you've already made a difference." He squeezed her hand, grateful for her support. "Thank you, Leah. I don't know how this will go, but I'm ready." It's time they listen. Marcus, who had been listening quietly, looked up with admiration in his eyes. "We're all proud of you, Dad. Whatever happens today, we're with you." Isaiah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. His family had endured so much in this fight, yet they stood beside him unwaveringly. As he left the house and made his way to the council chambers, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This meeting was more than just a proposal. It was the culmination of his efforts, his attempt to change the very system that had nearly crushed him under its assumptions and biases. The council chambers were packed when he arrived. Community members, reporters, activists, and a few curious onlookers had gathered, eager to witness the proceedings. Isaiah spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Devon was there, along with others who had shared their stories of profiling and discrimination. Their presence was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. He carried their stories, their voices, with him as he prepared to address the council. Captain Reynolds and Officer Rhodes were seated at a table to the side. Reynolds gave him a respectful nod, though Isaiah could see the tension in the captain's posture. Officer Rhodes avoided eye contact, her face carefully expressionless. Isaiah wasn't there to settle personal scores, but he couldn't ignore the irony of her presence. The very officer who had profiled him now sat in a room where her actions would become a catalyst for change. The council members took their seats, and after a few formalities, the council chairwoman invited Isaiah to present his case. He rose from his seat, calm but resolute, his voice steady as he began to speak. "Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to speak today," Isaiah began, his gaze sweeping over the room. "I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a member of this community, as a father, and as someone who has experienced the painful reality of racial profiling firsthand. I am here today to propose changes that I believe will make Briarcrest Grove a safer, more just community for all." He outlined his proposal methodically, beginning with mandatory racial sensitivity training for all officers, annual community reviews of law enforcement practices, and an independent oversight committee to investigate instances of profiling and discrimination. His words were clear, backed by evidence, and the testimonies of others who had experienced similar incidents. He spoke about the psychological toll of profiling, of the fear and humiliation it imposed on innocent individuals, and the urgent need to break the cycle. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. As he finished, Isaiah looked around, his heart pounding. This was his moment of truth. The council chairwoman, an older woman with a steely expression, cleared her throat. "Thank you, Judge Cole. We appreciate your passion and dedication to this cause. We will review your proposal, but please understand that implementing such changes may be costly, and we have to consider the broader impact on the community." Isaiah could feel the resistance beneath her words. He had anticipated this reaction, but had hoped that they might be willing to move beyond bureaucratic hesitation. Before he could respond, a voice broke the silence. "This isn't just about costs." Devon stood up from his seat, his voice trembling but resolute. "This is about fairness. People like me, like Judge Cole, shouldn't have to live in fear in our own neighborhoods. If you keep dismissing these issues as isolated, you're just ignoring the problem." Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others clapping quietly. The council chairwoman looked visibly uncomfortable, but Isaiah noticed a flicker of understanding in the eyes of a few other council members. Perhaps, just perhaps, his message was getting through. One of the council members, a younger man with a thoughtful expression, spoke up. "Judge Cole, I hear what you're saying, and I believe that the time for change is overdue. I'd like to suggest that we start with a pilot program, implementing some of these reforms on a smaller scale to see how they impact the community." The chairwoman frowned, clearly reluctant, but before she could respond, Captain Reynolds stood, his gaze firm. "I support Judge Cole's proposal," Reynolds said, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "We've seen too many incidents go unaddressed, and it's time we take accountability. These measures would only serve to strengthen our department and rebuild trust with the community." The tension in the room was palpable, but as the other council members exchanged glances, it became clear that the tides were shifting. The chairwoman finally nodded, albeit reluctantly. "Very well. We will proceed with the pilot program and revisit the proposal at a later date for possible expansion." Isaiah felt a surge of relief and triumph. It wasn't everything he had hoped for, but it was a start, a small but significant victory. He had opened the door, and now there was a path forward. As the meeting concluded, Isaiah made his way through the crowd, receiving nods and handshakes from supporters. Devon approached him, a bright smile on his face. "Judge Cole, you did it. They're finally listening." Isaiah nodded, smiling back. "This is just the beginning," Devon. But yes, they're listening. And now we keep pushing for real change. Outside the chambers, he saw Officer Rhodes waiting, her face a mixture of embarrassment and respect. She approached him hesitantly, clearing her throat. "Judge Cole," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say that I'm sorry. For that night, I made assumptions I shouldn't have, and I see that now. This has been a wake-up call for me." Isaiah studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Officer Rhodes. Apology accepted. Just remember that every interaction you have shapes someone's life, for better or worse. Let's make sure it's for the better." She nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes before she walked away, leaving Isaiah with a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about punishing wrongs. It was about encouraging people to change and learn. That evening, as Isaiah returned home, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. He was greeted by Leah's warm embrace, and as Marcus and Olivia joined them, he felt the weight of his family's support wrap around him like a protective shield. "I heard the council approved your proposal," Leah said, her voice filled with pride. "I knew you could do it." Isaiah smiled, holding her close. "I couldn't have done it without you, all of you." Later that night, as the family sat together in the living room, Isaiah felt a rare sense of joy. They had all sacrificed something in this fight, yet here they were, stronger, more united than ever. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this point, the painful memories, the struggle, and the countless moments he had wanted to give up. But tonight, he knew it had all been worth it. He looked at Marcus, who sat beside him, and felt a surge of hope for his son's future. Marcus would inherit a world that was still flawed, still struggling with prejudice and injustice, but Isaiah knew that the changes he had set in motion would pave the way for a better, fairer world. The journey wasn't over, but as Isaiah held his family close, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He was no longer just a judge fighting a solitary battle. He was part of a community, a movement, a legacy of resilience and courage. As the night deepened, Isaiah allowed himself to finally rest, secure in the knowledge that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for his family, his community, and all those who would come after him.